In the last video, we explored the implications of the bottom third of the world in wealth distribution, the poorest third of the world who currently use the US dollar as a store of value. We explored the implications of them gradually or suddenly abandoning the US dollar and perhaps embracing Bitcoin. But in this video, I want to explore some indications that there may be reasons for people to start abandoning the US dollar as a store of value, specifically inflation. And I mentioned how, if you're in an oppressive country that manages the domestic currency very poorly, a 1 or 2% inflation tax for the use of the US dollar is entirely justifiable from the perspective of someone who wants to have an alternative store of value to their domestic currency. But what if it's more than 2%? What if inflation starts to become not just background noise, but noticeable in everyday life? What if inflation of the US dollar starts to manifest in some really weird ways? And what if that leads to trust being lost in the US dollar as an effective store of value? Because I know for myself that I have noticed in my personal life some really weird things starting to happen with dollars. I'm not even going to talk about the macroeconomic situation here. We could mention the 100% run up in crude oil, lumber prices all-time high, shipping container rates. Just astonishing what's happening with shipping container rates. There's some weird stuff going on in the macroeconomic environment at the end of 2021. Absolutely. And they all point towards inflation. But just let's ignore that, because a lot of people don't pay, like normal people, and I mean people that don't listen to Bitcoin videos. They don't look at shipping container rates. They don't care about that. They don't see inflation in those terms. Most people do not pay attention to economics. They just look at what things cost in their everyday life and how the dollar behaves in relation to the way that they spend it. So let me give you one really strange example of how perhaps something is going on with the dollar and inflation. And this shouldn't be a surprise, because in the past year or two, the money printing that has occurred is just breathtaking. So in 2016, I bought a pickup truck for cash, a used one, for $7,500. Now, when it comes to my budget and money, I'm a little bit of a nerd, and I track things. And one of the things that I like to track is the black book value of my vehicles, mostly because I like to just see how rapidly they depreciate. I like to have the reminder that a vehicle is not only not an investment, vehicles are just they are money pits, horribly depreciating assets. And so I just like to track that. I like to see how rapidly they depreciate. And since I bought the truck in 2016, I put 60,000 kilometers on it, and up until 2020, its value had dropped basically 50%. At some point in 2020, it actually dipped below being worth $3,000. So it cut in half. It was over 50% depreciation in that 5 years. And that's entirely to be expected with a vehicle. However, a curious thing has occurred this year. Every month that I check the black book value of my truck, it has been going up. And not just a little bit. The current black book value of my truck just crossed over the $7,500 mark. I bought the truck 5 years ago for $7,500 and have put 60,000 kilometers on it since then. And I am now in the green. What is going on? You know, when inflation really starts to rev up, I think it's kind of like getting near the event horizon of a black hole. If you've seen in movies like Interstellar, you go near the event horizon and the gravity becomes so intense that the laws of physics themselves start to break down, and any relation to reality, it starts to warp and bend. Your perception of it does, at least. And that's kind of what I see happening here. The money printing that has occurred in the last 2 years has been so astronomical that the effects of it, perhaps, now this is just an anecdotal observation in relation to what's happening with the value of my used truck, but perhaps what is happening is we are starting to see things, weird things, strange anomalies in the fabric of economic reality start to appear, kind of like little disturbances or glitches in the matrix. Why would my used truck, why should I be green on that so-called investment? It has depreciated massively since I bought it. Well, that's something that happens with inflation, is the price of real goods and services goes up, not in proportion to their actual absolute value, but simply in proportion to the amount of dollars that have been printed. Now, when inflation is not red hot and it's just 2% a year, you don't notice these things. People are not equipped to notice 2% inflation year over year. They might reflect and say, oh, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, I remember when an ice cream cone cost 50 cents and now it's $1.50 or whatever the anecdote is. We have all had that experience. But it's an entirely different thing to see the value of your vehicle, your used vehicle, that has had incredible amounts of depreciation in terms of its real value. Like, it absolutely has deteriorated in its physical condition due to use and time. It is not doubled in its value. Absolutely not. It is not doubled in its intrinsic value. There's no way. Of course not. But the money has increased. I don't know about you, but at the grocery store, I see specific examples of specific foods that have had 100% inflation. since essentially last year. There's anyone that goes to the grocery store and does their own shopping, I think you know what I'm talking about. Inflation is starting to become something that is noticeable. Not only noticeable, but detrimental. It is becoming a burden, not just an insidious form of tax, like that insidious 2% tax that just harvests, very silently, very quietly in the background year after year. Now it would seem, perhaps, that inflation is a little more in your face. It's a little more, you can't ignore it anymore. Not only can you not ignore it when you're going grocery shopping, but as in the example with my truck, it is manifesting in some really weird stuff. This is weird. This is like this is like being near the event horizon of a black hole, of an economic black hole, and everything that we understand about value in relation to the dollars that we work for is starting to warp and distort. And of course, the point of this whole video is not, it's not about the anecdote. The point of this is, to the extent that these anomalies and disruptions continue to occur and increase in magnitude, if that does indeed occur, what is going to happen to your own attitude towards your domestic currency? And what is going to happen to the attitude of people abroad who perhaps use your domestic currency as a store of value? And what happens, and this is the great unknown. I'm very curious to see how this turns out. But what happens in the next financial crisis on the level of, let's say, 2008? What happens in the next crisis if the dollar is not seen as a safe haven? What happens in the next crisis if the dollar is the crisis? What happens if people decide that they must flee to a different safe haven? What safe haven is that going to be if it's not the dollar? What safe haven is that going to be if it's not U.S. treasuries? What if U.S. treasuries themselves are the crisis? Where do people go? In the stock market crash of 2020, we saw one of the largest collapses in the price of Bitcoin in history, because what occurred in early 2020 was a classic textbook example of deflation. And in a deflationary event like that, it is cash and bonds that are treated as the safe haven, and that's absolutely what happened. Now, everyone is predicting that if the stock market crashes now or sometime in the near to mid future, that if that occurs, that Bitcoin will crash as well. But that assumes a deflationary event. What if the next crisis is not deflationary in nature, but as was the case in the 70s, what if it is the beginning of an inflationary crisis? Stagflation, the combination of inflation combined with economic contraction. We haven't seen that for 50 years. Most people alive in their professional careers have not experienced that. Most people alive were in middle school during the 70s, or not alive at all to have any reference point to remember in regards to what it's like to have a combination of very high inflation and economic contraction, stagflation. What if the next crisis is not deflationary, but it is inflationary? Then, in that case, the flight to safety, the safe haven, is not cash and bonds. It's the opposite. Cash and bonds are what are being destroyed. They are people that hold them are the ones that are getting wrecked. In that case, what you want is something like Bitcoin or gold, but you know what? Since the market bottom of Bitcoin last year, what was the response of central banks across the world? It was to unleash money printing like we've never seen before, not in the West at least. And what happened to Bitcoin? Bitcoin went from whatever its low was in March of 2020 to whatever it is now, essentially a 10x more than that. And what has gold done? Gold's done nothing in that same period. Gold has not responded to money printing at all in a period in which money printing is occurring in the West like we've never seen before. As if this is Argentina or Zimbabwe or something. Gold has not responded at all. Bitcoin has. What happens in the next crisis if inflation is the crisis? If we see inflation not just doing some weird things in our anecdotally that we notice, but what happens if inflation becomes a real problem? What happens to Bitcoin if people realize that they need to flee from the dollar, to flee from inflation, to have a safe haven? And gold's done nothing in the past year. And Bitcoin's already had a 10x. That I'm curious to see. I'm curious to see how that plays out in the next financial crisis. Because I think Bitcoin defies expectations, because everyone is predicting that Bitcoin will crash along with the stock market in the next financial crisis. Perhaps that is exactly the opposite of what will occur.